So thank you for joining this report launch for my Winston Churchill Memorial Trust Fellowship that I undertook. We have an amazing panel here to talk about the report, to talk about foster care for adolescents with complex needs, and to think about how we can maybe take some of the recommendations forward, but also in our respective ways where we have some power in the system, and what can we do now? So I'm actually not going to open up the session. I'm going to play a recording from a young person who you may have seen in the report that I volunteer with. I'm her independent visitor. And firstly, she's under 18, and so it wasn't appropriate for her to join, but also she was a bit shy, but she recorded some voice notes to open this event. And so I'm hoping everybody can hear her welcome. Bear with me, here we go.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining my event on kids who are in care and the way they should be treated. Kids who are in care is very important. It's more important because they're part of the government and they need to be taken deep serious, and they should be treated way more supported and help. How can we improve foster care for teenagers with complex needs? Well, the best thing that you should do is spend loads of quality time with them. And what means that do one-to-one with them, because kids who are in care, they've been abandoned away from their parents and they don't know what love is. So by foster carers showing them love, by spending time with them and being one-to-one time with them and understanding that they are support. What do teenagers need for good foster home? They need someone who they can be able to talk to, because some carers, they don't care about them and they don't really want to have a good relationship with them. So someone that they can be able to talk to tell them about their feelings, and for their foster carer to be able to support them and manage their emotions and the way how they feel and to understand them. Because some people may have mental health issues where the carers don't really care about them and they'll just chuck them out to the house. No, that's not how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to carers to sit down, talk to them, understanding how their feelings and what support they will need, and is that one-to-one time with them. All kids need it because they've been abandoned away from their parents and they don't know what the love and affection that means to them. And also they need somewhere where they can sit, where they can have their own privacy. They have things that they want, not all of them, not everything that they want, but some stuff that they want, and they can be able to have some time where they can chill by themselves. And also they need someone who can be able to love them and care for them and support them, not love the way how they will show it to their parents with their own children, but love to show them that they care about them and they need that support and a bit of love to show them that they are their own children and they will look after the way how they look after their own children. That's the way they will look after the kid who's in care or have complex needs, because kids with complex needs, they struggle a lot and they need someone who's always there to listen to them, to always there to help them and give them good advice, because some carers, they wouldn't want to do that and they will be like, oh, I'm sick of this child, let's send them to another care home. I'm sick of this child, let's send them to another care home. And that's called an abandon, and I don't believe kids who are in care should be felt like that. So yeah.
So that was the opening of this launch from a young person who is very special and amazing, and who I have been an independent visitor to or with for the past 3 years, and herself in that time has had several foster carers that she has lived with, and so she's very passionate about this report topic, and was one of the reasons actually that I also wanted to look into this area. So thank you for joining us this evening. I'm going to introduce our panelists in a moment. Even though this is a webinar, we do want it to be very interactive, and so please make use of the chat function. The structure of the event is that we'll be discussing a theme within the report, and there will be time after that discussion for you to drop some comments or questions in the chat to contribute to the discussion before we move on to the next theme. So to introduce our panel, we have got great panel, if I say so myself. I'm going to go around the screen in terms of who's here. I'll go clockwise. So I'm starting with Andy. So some of you may know Andy Elvin. He is the Chief Executive of TACT Foster Care, so the Adolescent and Children's Trust. He's been there since 2014. It's the UK's largest dedicated fostering and adoption charity. Andy is a social worker and former foster carer. He's also the co-author of the book Welcome to Fostering, and is the chair of the Fairer Fostering Partnership, an umbrella organisation of not-for-profit fostering agencies. Next round my screen, I have Baroness Young of Hornsey. So thank you for joining us. And Baroness Young, after an extensive career, Lola Young went on to become, extensive acting career, sorry, Lola Young went on to become a professor of cultural studies at Middlesex University, a writer, broadcaster and cultural critic. Subsequently, she became head of culture at the Greater London Authority, being appointed an independent cross-bench member of the House of Lords. Lola has sat on several select committees and founded the all-party parliamentary group on ethics and sustainability in fashion and on sport, modern slavery and human rights. Lola now campaigns to improve legislation on modern slavery and transparency in supply chain reporting. Lola is also vice chair of the APPG for Looked After Children, and she is the Chancellor of the University of Nottingham. Beneath me, on my screen, I have Valentina Enrica. So I actually haven't prepared your bio, Valentina, but Valentina is who holds together Laurelle Brown Training and Consultancy. So she's probably the most important person in my company. She's the operations executive, and she ensures that essentially my head stays connected to my body and I'm able to arrive on time to events like this. So thank you very much, Valentina. Next, we have Professor Ravinda Barn. So Ravinda is Professor of Social Policy in the Department of Law and Criminology. She is the author and editor of 8 books and over 100 journal papers or book chapters. Ravinda writes on gender, ethnicity, child and youth welfare, and criminal justice. Her research on child welfare and migrant groups is highly regarded nationally and internationally. Ravinda's empirical work on sexual violence and the judiciary in India has been among the top 10 most read papers in the British Journal of Criminology. And then last but not least, we have Brigitte. Brigitte Jourdan, who I had the pleasure of working with, and actually this is where this piece of research was born when we were together at Barnet. So Brigitte is the Director of Children's Social Care in Family Services at the London Borough of Barnet. And Brigitte qualified as a social worker in South Africa in 1990. After 11 years of working with communities on rural forestry stations and informal settlements, she immigrated to the UK in 2001. Brigitte has worked with families and children across various local authorities. In 2016, Brigitte joined the senior management team at Barnet Family Services and worked alongside a focused and committed group of leaders to transform Barnet's children's services from being inadequate to one that is good with the potential of being excellent, outstanding. So thank you all of you for joining this evening, and look forward to the conversation, and welcome to those of you who are tuned in and watching. So I'm going to start off with some questions, and as I said, please make use of the chat. We want you guys to let us know your thoughts, your experiences, your reflections, and anything you have to comment really about the report and the topic. At some points our videos may go will be switched off if we're struggling with bandwidth, so just to forewarn you. So I'm going to start off with a question which is going to be directed to Brigitte. I went to do this research. I travelled to Sweden, France, Germany, Switzerland and Portugal with the aim of researching foster care for adolescents with complex needs. This followed in Barnet several years of increasing rates of young people coming into care, but we had a particular spike of those who were adolescents, and in particular those with who were unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. And so at the time we started this journey and looking at our kind of placement sufficiency and our fostering provision, we were looking at some key trends, which was that we had a number of adolescents who had complex needs, so was sexually exploited or at risk of criminal exploitation, mental health needs, and who were unaccompanied. We didn't necessarily have enough carers or those who could provide the level of care that would sustain the placement. We had some breakdowns, and so we discussed this research and thought about, you know, what we could do. I wanted to talk to you about one of the themes, which actually was about the role of birth families, because I went to look at foster care, but actually came across some real stark differences in the way that these countries respond and support birth families in the context of foster care. And I found that birth families play a far more integral role in the decision making and care planning compared to the UK. And, you know, based on the examples I saw, it seems that if we actually increase the birth family's involvement in the planning for their child and engage them and support them, we may actually have more success in reunification. And so I wanted to ask what your thoughts are about the report recommendations and how local authorities could potentially look at involving birth families more for this adolescent cohort and going into foster care.
Thanks, Laurelle. I mean, first of all, I'd like to say that it was great reading the research and the report. Thank you. It also is a stark reminder that although we might be doing different things in different countries, we have similar concerns, similar worries about young people, and similar challenges. And it was really interesting to see the different focus around birth families. I think in the UK, it's a complex situation because we often, and fellow people on the panel will know, our young adolescents come into our care in a point of crisis where they're not speaking to their parents and their parents aren't speaking to them, and it's really, really difficult to mediate those situations. But I think where we are able to do that, there's some really good examples of good practice where that mediation happens, but it has to happen right at the start. If you don't start those conversations at the point of crisis, then they get lost somewhere along the line. I think any of us who have had adolescents, our own adolescents, and we've parented adolescents, we know that part of the strategy of surviving as a parent of an adolescent is adjusting the way we communicate, is adjusting the way we respond to situations, and sometimes by not responding at all and just keeping quiet. But often our parents that we work with don't understand those strategies and can't implement those strategies because there's too much going on in everybody's life. And I think for local authorities and for social workers, if we can build in the mechanism by which we conversations in the beginning of a child's journey, then we have better results. I also think that one of the things that I've been thinking of since I read the report is that we don't celebrate the number of people, the number of children that actually do return home. You know, our data and our reports and our regional benchmarking is all about the numbers who are in care. But really and I went and had a look at the information in Barnet, and there's a lot of movement of children actually returning to their parents, returning home, and I think there is something about looking at and understanding what worked well there, and when you look at the individual situations and the individual case examples and the journey of the child, it's all about those communications, it's all about those relationships. A lot of local authorities and in Barnet, we have done a lot of work around contextual work, contextual safeguarding, understanding our young people's context, because it's so very, very different to when we were adolescents. I was an adolescent in South Africa completely different context. And as a social worker, I have the responsibility to find out what my young people's context is. And when we do that, then we can adjust our tools, we can adjust our communication style so that we can have those conversations. I also think that because of care proceedings, court action, there are a lot of parents that aren't open to having conversations with the social worker who is responsible for taking their child into care. Whether they are voluntarily accommodated or under a court order makes no difference. It's, you know, I don't think we always understand and grasp the full range of emotions that a parent goes through when these situations occur. And you know, our children are desperate, but our parents are also desperate. And I think that there is something about understanding the context so that we can work with parents so that they can also understand our children's context, because it's very complicated with social media. The school context is very different, and the push of gangs, of sexual exploitation, all the things that our children have to be scared about are all present, and we don't always understand. So I think that there is something about looking at our models, looking at our structures, where we provide alternatives to just the allocated worker who is the only person that liaises with all these different people. When we have advocates or we have mentors who work with the parents, we sometimes have better results in terms of being able to mediate. And there's some good examples across the whole country where people work as units, people work as teams around the family, and not just around the child, but around the family. And we don't lose the concept of the family. That, you know, that is very, very important. I think when I read the report, there was a lovely statement in the report, and it says that we mustn't shrink, and I love this, we mustn't shrink our ambitions and efforts to ensure that foster care or the care arrangement is suitable for every child. And I think that is something that we really need to think about in terms of our approach to adolescence. We need to understand how, you know, how the brain works of an adolescent. We have to understand their responses, and then also make sure that we look at, you know, the report looks at a lot of creative ideas, and some of the things that we've looked at, and I've looked at through my career, is a shared care, where you're not separating child from family, but you're bringing a foster carer alongside to help the family just have a bit of a breather, because sometimes you just need to breathe and stop shouting, and it's just time to just moderate that language so that the child doesn't feel you know, so badly rejected by the family unit. So I think there is some work to be done, lots of work to be done, to actually make sure that when we recruit and when we work with foster carers, they feel comfortable in coming in alongside the family. We talk a lot about social workers coming in alongside families and relationship work with families. But when a family is in a point of crisis and they can't actually be together, we should potentially have an option where there is someone that can come in, that is not the social workers trying to take their child away, but somebody who can actually be a support and a mentor to the whole family. One of the things that we talk about in terms of real complexity is our young adolescents with special education needs, and especially autism. And one of the things that we are looking at is trying to help parents really understand the strategies needed and the parenting style that's needed when the child is younger, so that when they get to adolescence, they have those strategies in place. But then again, you've got to revisit it, because it's not, definitely not one size fits all. And you know, if I think about how my parenting style has had to change over the years, and I've got grown-up kids and it's still changing, I think we all need to understand that for parents, we need to fill their tank and fill their toolbox, just as we do as professionals. So you know, in terms of my advice and my ambition for the children of Barnet is to switch my phone off, first of all, because that doesn't happen unless I'm on a webinar or in court. So what our ambition really is to make sure that where there is a situation where a child cannot be with their parents for a period of time, we have options, we have different options, and the right options, so that they can go to an alternative care arrangement, the right one at the first time. Because I think one of the other things that we have a problem with in terms of helping out our children go back to their families is when they start bouncing around the care system, because then our focus is diverted away from that reunification. It's really, we need to stay focused on where they can be held while we do that work between them and their families, to try and heal and mend those relationships, and also redefine those relationships. And that's how I think we would attempt to start working to bring birth families back in alongside our adolescents.
Thank you, Brigitte. What an opening. I've made so many notes. I should probably say to you guys, and also those in the chat, that I have got a meeting as well with the DFE policy team, the fostering policy team, to discuss the recommendations and also some of the themes from this. I mean, obviously it's not a magic wand and absolutely not going to change the world, but I do want to carry back some of the things that come up in this webinar discussion. So thank you so much. I'm just going to open it up to the panel. Does anybody want to come in on any of the themes that Brigitte just mentioned, or the recommendations that we're discussing, which is local authorities should ensure their children's services provide holistic wraparound support to birth families with adolescents on the edge of or in care, or local authorities should take every effort to involve birth families in care and pathway plans and decision making pertaining to their children. So those are the two recommendations. So I'll open out to the panel and then I'll come to the question in the chat.
Yeah, happy to come in, and just to echo some of the things that were said, and maybe a step back first and a bit of context about the contrast with Europe. We have a adversarial court system that not all European countries have. Some have inquisitorial court systems or more problem-solving courts of the type that we have with FDAC here, which is a wonderful way to run proceedings, and that can lead to it being more difficult to work with birth parents in the first instance. You take someone to court, they're less likely to talk to you. And we also have to remember that removing children, in the absence of the death penalty, removing someone's children is probably the most punitive thing we do legally in this country. And I think sometimes as a profession we forget that. The other contextual point is that most of continental Europe does not have non-consensual adoption. And that's huge culturally. It's absolutely huge. It also makes a huge difference to the fostering demographic. We may come to that later on. I'd just like to really echo the point about mediation. It's so important when working with teenagers and and their families, is that mediation has to be a key part of it, because adolescents are going to vote with their feet. If they don't agree with the plan that you've made for them, it doesn't meet their needs, they're not going to hang around. They're going to find somewhere that does meet their needs, or meet their needs as they see them. And I noticed a point about collusion in the chat, which is very, very important to support carers with that. Can we
read it out, Andy? Can you read it?
How can we do this does not allow collusion, which can be a risk for new carers who are managing children's parents' behaviours? And how is this transparent with fostering services and the child social worker? I think we have to trust foster carers. We have to recruit them well and train them, but we have to trust them. I talk a lot in TACT about the myth of control.
Yeah.
We see foster carers for, an hour, maybe a couple of hours a week. They're looking after the children 24/7. We have to trust them. We have to delegate authority properly. And when we're allowing them to work with parents closely, which I'm a great advocate of, I think we have a lot of success with parents and foster carers working together, because foster carers can bring a lot of expertise and experience in dealing with exactly the behaviours that the parents are trying to deal with. And the power imbalance is not there. You know, foster carers do not have the legal authority to seek to remove children. And that's a huge thing as well. Yeah. But we have to be careful that, you know, that they are alive to the task that they are doing, and that, you know, parents are struggling, parents are dealing with things that are probably beyond their skill set, and we're trying to help them with that. And collusion is something one has to be alive to, I think. Yeah,
I think it's, you know, it also goes to, sorry, and it goes to the supervision and the training. You know, we're still right in the middle of a very virtual world where foster carers have actually been doing an incredible amount of work with both parents around contact, around communication. We have seen relationships being built through a child taking their phone around their foster family's home and saying, oh, this is my bedroom, this is where I am, and those links have become much stronger than ever before. And I think that there's a lot to be learned from what has come out of an international crisis, where people have learned to just be more tolerant, and I think there is we do foster carers an injustice if we talk about them not being professional or that collusion. And I know we've all got examples of where it might have happened, but we have many more examples of where that relationship has actually enabled a child to form really good relationships with their parents, and where a foster carer has enabled the reunification and has done the outreach work to be able to help them sustain new relationships. So I think it's about celebrating those examples and learning from them to take that into our fostering support and our fostering training, and adjust some of the way that we prepare our foster carers for this work.
Absolutely. We have to remember that foster carers are the experts in the children they're looking after, and they know more about that child than anyone else except the birth family, far more than anyone in the professional network. And any meeting that you have about the child or the foster placement that doesn't involve the foster carer, you are doing a disservice to that child, and you shouldn't be having that meeting. The only time you have that meeting is when it's about the foster carers, when there's an allegation. Far too often people work around or over the head of the foster carers. Everything should be through the foster carers, because they're the ones having the interaction with the child. And, you know, recovery from trauma, therapeutic intervention is done, you know, conversation by conversation, you know, hour in, hour out in foster homes. That's how it works.
Absolutely.
And we need to work far more through them. Yeah, sorry, carry on, Laura.
I'm going to interject because I thought Lola was going to come in, and I just want to give her the chance before I move on to the next question.
Actually, Laurelle, it's fine, because I can wrap up what I was going to say in my comments later. So don't worry, just keep to schedule.
Okay, I'm going to go to Ravinda.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that Bridget said right at the start, and also just start off by saying, Laurelle, that well done on this really important work and on the fellowship. It's tremendous, and it's great that you also, obviously, the organisation of this forum today, and it's great because these discussions need to be had. But Bridget said right at the outset about crisis intervention, that, you know, that's what we've kind of tended to do in this country. And I'm a qualified social worker myself, and when I did my PhD back in the 1980s, what I actually documented was how that was happening in terms of the lack of preventive work and the crisis intervention, particularly where we were talking about, again, children with complex needs, but Black and minority ethnic children coming into care at a much more speedy rate than were other children, but all children were actually experiencing that lack of preventive work. So I just wanted to kind of flag up, you know, the 89 Children Act and the reunification, which has been mentioned already, being kind of the key aim. but there is still this kind of persistence of a set of assumptions that operate about the birth family, and I think which make it very challenging to bring them into discussions that need to be had about their children. And then I think that's what we're saying in terms of whether it's about contact, whether it's about communication. And again, Bridget's point about how perhaps the internet and social media can be a mediating tool, it can be an enabler. And I think it's about actually, you know, adopting these or adapting our methods, I guess, to make use of new forms of technology, etc., to really, I guess, in the best interest of the children, and in the way that the young person right at the outset told us that, you know, these were the kind of key things that really mattered for them in terms of meeting emotional needs, psychological needs, that kind of quality time. And, you know, that can't happen in the absence of that consultation with the birth family. We cannot write off birth families as having failed and not part and parcel of decisions that need to be made about children.
Thank you very much, everybody. I've made some, well, lots of notes, and I'm going to keep us moving through. I warned everybody, the panel, before we started, that as a collective we could talk about this all day, so I'm going to try and keep us on track with the time, but obviously we're all very passionate about this topic. So I'm going to come to Ravinda next and focus on one of the next theme, which was around recruitment and commissioning. And I made a couple of recommendations, one regarding local authorities, and they should take some time to understand the makeup of local migrant communities and develop approaches to understand the barriers they face in the labour market, and maybe look at ways to devise targeted fostering recruitment campaigns, because in Sweden it was really interesting in Malmo, where they had really mobilised their migrant community and managed to engage them in a whole host of different roles in the community, including formal and informal foster care. And then another recommendation was around the central and local government and VCS, or voluntary community sector, committing to commissioning, developing and delivering more innovative foster placements as part of a diverse placement offer for care experienced young people. And this was because actually, for example, in France, they utilize a range, they have foster carers, but they also have placements in Africa where children who have, you know, they need a different type of care, and that structured environment or that family environment just, it wasn't working. And so they have these opportunities for young people to get a breather, almost going to Senegal or Algeria and just immersing themselves in a different culture and a different kind of informal environment for a while before coming back. And I wondered what your thoughts were on that recommendation, where you think there might be opportunities, firstly to recruit from diverse backgrounds, but also looking at potentially developing more innovative and non-traditional options, placement options for care experienced adolescents.
Yeah, and that's always been a challenge for local authorities in the UK and elsewhere, I guess, in kind of multiracial Western societies. The social work profession needs to do far more. I mean, I kind of come to this from a very critical perspective and have always done for the last 30 years. You know, the profession of social work needs to do far more to ensure that their pool of foster carers reflect the racial and cultural diversity of the children who are in their care. They need to ensure that foster carers are actually equipped to deal with the complexity of need in the present time. They need to actually help ensure that foster carers are adequately trained and supported to avoid disruption, because that continues to be an ongoing concern, an ongoing problem. And as again, the young person was telling us at the start of this forum, that, you know, instead of actually that kind of staying power, if you like, that's needed on the part of the foster carer, and instead of demonstrating that, perhaps it can be too easy to say, well, I can't look after this child, they need to move on because I just can't cope with the kind of the complexity of need that's here. So that kind of really, I think, you know, that adequate support, training, ongoing training, not just kind of one-off right at the start, but the ongoing training that's kind of so necessary to recognize the signs of potential possible disruption that might happen, and where support is needed for the foster carers. And it seems that there are obviously geographical variations. There are shortages in the pool of foster carers available to to place children with complex needs. And sometimes it's that kind of poor matching that leads to placement breakdowns. And then I think that's a real concern. And there are consortiums in place, and I think that's great when local authorities can come together to work together to meet the needs in their regions, in their areas. But really, I think greater levels of outreach work. We've been saying this since the 70s, the Soul Kids campaign in South London, which was Lewisham, and and then other local authorities also became involved in the 80s and so on. So this kind of outreach work needed to raise awareness of the need for more foster carers from a range of different backgrounds to meet the range of needs that children present with. Social work professionals also needing kind of better training to be able to recognize risk and vulnerability. And as I say, signs of potential placement disruption. These have been kind of ongoing concerns. And as a researcher, I would say we need more evidence-based practice. We need more research too. And I think sometimes, it's great that local authorities come together and pool together their knowledge and expertise to work together, but it's not a bad idea to work with their local universities too, in terms of research and evaluation. So those are just some of the things that I want to kind of say that, but the other thing is about retention of foster carers. So once, that there is recruitment of excellent foster care, it's about how do we retain them? And that takes us back to the point I was making earlier about that kind of ongoing support, which is so necessary. So those are just some of the things I want to say at this point. And I know that I'm not a big fan of Martin Neri, for instance, but in a report that he wrote a couple of years ago, he talked about adequate monetary recognition also being crucial. Again, those geographical variations continue to exist. But in his review of foster care in England, he talks with Mark Owers, he talks about foster carers, they might be caring for a child or children of exceptional challenge. And that's what we're talking about, that kind of complexity of need and that kind of adequate, appropriate remuneration. And that should be compared to, if those children needed to be cared for elsewhere. And in terms of cost benefit, because the whole kind of neoliberal world tends to be about costs and benefits and efficiency and all of that. But so he makes an important point about the adequate monetary recognition of foster carers too. So I just want to kind of stop there for now. I think that
Thank you very much, Ravinda, again. Just really insightful and thought-provoking feedback. And yeah, in your mention there of the training not just being one-off, I think that really struck a chord with me, because obviously I go around and do a lot of training with foster carers and of children's services and independent fostering agencies, and that is one of my key messages. This has to be part of an ongoing agenda, diverse agenda offer for your carers and for your staff. This shouldn't just be, in the case of my current inquiries, a one-off session on Black Lives Matter because somebody was murdered in America, for example. Anti-oppressive practice, anti-racist practice, that should be at the heart of your social work practice, at the heart of your service and organisation, generally anyway. So in the chat, a couple of comments there. Thank you, Tony Cisse. Overseas placement options are very interesting. I know of one boy from France placed with my in-laws in Senegal, a huge experience for the young person. And Andy has responded saying, agreed, placing with relatives overseas is still an underused option. Working with local services on the assessment and planning for ongoing support is key. Just opening it up to the panel now, or anybody else watching who might want to add a comment or reflection in the chat on this specific theme around, having placements that are not so traditional when we think of foster care, or the way that we can recruit a more diverse range of carers from a range of backgrounds. Anyone want to add anything further?
I think in terms of the training, it's not just training, it's the kind of support and services you're offering to the foster family. There's an awful lot of sitting around waiting for CAMS, when often CAMS isn't actually going to be useful. The young person doesn't have an emerging mental health need. They have behaviour that's born out of trauma, or early trauma. And we've had a lot of success with having psychology services working directly with the foster carers. So the foster carers are getting every 2 weeks some reflective supervision, say, well, we've tried these techniques, we've tried this. How's it all gone? Let's reflect and let's go again for the next 2 weeks. Let's adjust and adapt as we go. And we found that services like that allow foster carers to hold very difficult situations and very difficult behaviours far longer, because they feel held themselves. They feel that they are being supported. And I think sometimes we ask foster carers to deal with some very, very difficult situations without the level of support they need to do it, because the emotional toll on the, the foster carers, the danger of secondary trauma is very real and is there. And so the more that can be done, the better, I think, with foster carers, and that will allow us to support them with, more complex young people. And of course, often the pushback is the additional money it will cost. But quite often, foster carers are looking after teenagers who, if the foster placement fails, if it can't work out, the next stage is residential care, where you're going to be spending another £3,500–4,000 £4,000 a week anyway. So, throwing in an extra £300–400 a week to this placement is probably a far better deal. But the short-termism of financial decisions is a challenge and will always be a challenge. We can't get away from the annualised nature of the way local authorities are funded, which makes life difficult. Gladstone apparently is to blame for that. I learned this year it was Gladstone who introduced annualised funding and no one saw fit to think that actually children have childhoods that last 18 years, so perhaps budgets should be thought of in childhood terms and not in annual terms.
Andy, I will quote that at my next budget meeting. I just want to add, I think, Ravinda, your point about matching, that it's so integral to all the decisions that we make, and we have, when we see children really being successful and finding their way through their journey, is when we've been able to do planned moves for them, when we've been able to match carefully and involved everybody around them in those decision making, and that you can see the impact of that collective decision making where it makes a difference. And I completely agree with Andy. It's we local authorities have to do a lot of training of their foster carers, but do we ever stop to think whether they're actually purposeful, or are we just ticking a box? Are we actually equipping them with what they need for the children that we have in our care at this time? And I think we've had to really think about that and adjust some of the way we work with them. Having the psychological services alongside the foster carers absolutely pays loads of dividends, and we, I think local authorities who've got their integrated clinical services are fortunate that actually we have got systemic family therapists, we've got psychologists who can come in and support foster carers in their thinking and their responses to our young people, and that dovetails into the clinical work that we do with the young people, and treat it as a family unit, so that they can manage the situations better. I think the one thing that I would love to be able to bottle is how our foster carers have managed the last 8 months, because it's not just in Barnet, but the stability that we have seen and the resilience of these family units has absolutely been fantastic. And that's down to foster carers, because we haven't been able to get in largely, unless it's falling apart. And I know that research is going on, but I hope that it really gives us some clear understanding. It's Laurelle, this is your next book maybe. So, you know, just to understand and see what made that difference is what we need to know.
Yeah, just to come on the back of that, we've been doing some of this research. We've been very struck by the stability. It's not to say there haven't been problems, there have, but there has been a lot of stability in the foster system during COVID. And, you know, getting involved by exception, we need to begin to understand, and not getting involved just because the regulations say that we should. And how we have the first few weeks of someone being in a foster home working, because being together and doing things together as a family has been very, very good for the carers and the children. And yet when we place children, it's right, you've got to be in school 9 o'clock tomorrow, you've got to be at this place, you've got to be, we don't sometimes give them the chance to become a family unit, to start making those relationships and start putting down those roots, and, you know, not only physically unpacking, but emotionally unpacking, which so many of our children, particularly adolescents, don't do very easily. And back to the recruitment point, it's about our best carers. Some of our best carers are ones that have been rejected sometimes by local authorities and other agencies because they're non-traditional, I think is the word I would use. And sometimes the most eccentric carers are the best for some of our adolescents because they are so different to the family unit that they've come from. And some of the things, the behaviours that might have been carried over otherwise aren't. And sometimes, you know, we put our best efforts into matching, but, you know, sometimes the most unlikely partnerships or the most unlikely combinations of children and adults are pure spun gold. And we have to remember that. So the more diverse in every sense our foster carer cohort is, the better. We don't get to decide what the archetypal family looks like. It's not a choice we should be making.
Thanks, Andy. And that is absolutely also what I saw in the countries. For example, in Sweden, that is why I noted it, because, you know, the way that they had really focused on the assets, we talk about strengths-based approach, this migrant community, they really tapped into the assets within those communities, the kind of matriarchal caring nature and their suitability to offer that stability for these children and young people. But ordinarily, I definitely think there is a bias maybe. We don't even think of migrant communities really. We do think of the established ones where we're maybe on second generation, third generation, but, you know, our newer migrant communities, I definitely see a gap in some of the like strategic needs assessments that I read, for example, or corporate parenting reports. When we look at the demographic of the carers, you know, I definitely feel like there's some untapped potential in some communities and some carers that we could seek to, you know, investigate and explore. I'm going to just head to the chat. There's a couple of comments. So Catherine Lockett, we also need to listen to carers when placements break down and allow them to contribute to the matching for the next placement. Also that local authorities try to not operate in emergencies. We see too often very poor referral information, but also being sent out to providers at the 11th hour. This would contribute to reducing placement breakdown. So having sufficient information.
Just echo that and say that asset-based referrals give you so much more choice in a number of foster carers. You know, a lot of our young people describe the information sent out about them as the greatest hits of the worst things that have ever happened to them. And that's not who children are. And the number of foster carers who will say the child in that bedroom is not the child in that information. And we have to think, and I know, you know, why people do it, because they're cutting and pasting information they've written for a child protection report or a court statement because they're busy. But you have to write from an asset-based. Foster carers are looking for a hook. They're looking for something about that child that resonates with their family. And if all you write is, you know, we had one where under the positive information, it said the young lady sometimes takes her medication. That's the best they could come up with in terms of positive. And if that's what you're sending out, then children are going to end up in residential, because foster carers aren't going to be thinking this is a young person I can help.
Yeah, and I'm going to keep us moving through the comments, but I know, no, that's fine, thank you. I know my young person would really appreciate you saying that as well, because obviously she's had multiple foster placements over the past few years, and yeah, I certainly think that people should have been speaking much more positively about her, and I see a very different side of her to what's written and stuff that's sent to me. So Tony Cisse, With placements, especially when trying to match young people and foster carers, issues of diversity need to be considered beyond the superficial and to recognise diversity within communities. Example would be assumption at a Muslim family with origins in the Asian subcontinent might be suitable for a young Muslim from Iran or Mali. Sometimes it may be better to look at the foster carers' understanding, training, and understanding of difference than trying to find a direct match. Thank you, Tony. John Brown, how do we best develop and transform carer assessment to develop and encourage a more diverse cohort of carers? And Alice Ogabuli, matching is so important for the young person and the carer, as I've worked with foster carers who have felt extremely de-skilled when they have not been able to manage a young person's behaviour as they were not informed of all their needs. There needs to be transparency from social workers in the first instance about the complex needs and not make a decision because it's 5 p.m. and the young person needs to be placed. So that echoes, yeah, I can see.
Okay, I'll just go and put my hard hat on now. I completely agree. You know, I wish that local authorities had cracked this years ago. I've been working in local authorities for 20 years in the UK, and I just, it was so much easier in South Africa. You just went and grabbed someone who really loved children, and they didn't have to be approved through a panel with all the tick boxes and all the regulations, and they took that child on for life. But here we have regulations and here we have processes, but I think sometimes local authorities need to learn how to be a bit braver in terms of the work that we do with foster carers during the assessment process. Because, you know, there is, just like when we do assessments of families, there is no reason why we shouldn't be working with foster carers in that journey, rather than just interrogating them on their lifestyle and the sizes of their bedrooms. And I know that it's more complex than that, but I think that we have to see them as such valuable assets for our children, because there are always going to be children who cannot remain at home for really sad reasons. So we have to make sure that we understand how precious our foster carers are, and how we, if they've got the will and they've got the want to do this, why don't we work more effectively with them to bring them along on their journey as well, so that they can be the best for our children. I think there's also, I could talk about, sorry, I will stop.
This is your last minute. Yes.
I know, but everybody talks about children worrying about social workers changing. Foster carers are their significant person. When they come and throughout their care journey, when you talk to care leavers, they talk about their foster carers. And we as social workers need to sometimes remember that we just need to step back and be in the background and support and hold, so that our foster carers can be that significant relationship that will carry on beyond that 18th birthday. And I'll keep quiet.
But that is a very important point. And Ian Dixon, most of you will be familiar with him. I emailed him the report, obviously, and asked for his feedback. And that was one of his main points, reiterating that the care experience does not end at 18. It doesn't end at 21, nor does it end at 25. That, you know, this is it impacts your life, and the support and the networks that you need far beyond your 25th birthday aren't there. And that they should be. So actually really pertinent point there that you mentioned. Thank you, Brigitte. Andy, I'm going to come to you next. And actually, I think with this question, you might be able to pick up John's point about how do we best develop and transform carer assessment to develop and encourage a more diverse cohort of carers. So I wanted to ask you about the recommendations I made about foster carers. In the first instance, it was about central and local government should lead the development of a business case for regional fostering agencies in collaboration with independent fostering agencies, foster carers and young people. And I'm particularly interested to hear what you've got to say, because obviously TACT, you've actually played a number of roles in terms of being a fostering agency and also embedded as the local authority in a way. And then local authorities, fostering networks and independent fostering agencies need to explore how to minimise foster carers being out of pocket during vacant periods. And I saw some really interesting practice in Germany, for example, where they have very tight restrictions. After a certain period, foster carers can then be offered, will be matched with young people from different towns, different like boroughs, in the equivalent of boroughs, municipalities in Berlin, for example. So they try to change the system to minimize that financial impact, where sometimes we have I see on Twitter, foster carers will be tweeting like, I haven't had a young person for 6 months, like, you know, what's going on, etc., etc. So just wondering what your thoughts are on the regional commissioning. I know across England we've got some examples. In London, for example, we have the North London Adoption and Fostering Consortium, West London Alliance. What are your thoughts on that? I really think actually we should be driving that forward. You know, we've got a market that's broken, and we shouldn't talk about markets, children and people, but that's how it's seen. And then about the out-of-pocket expenses, what can we do? I imagine your foster carers might have something to say about that.
Indeed. So we'll start from the macro and go down towards the micro. Fostering is a market, sadly. It's been allowed to become so over the past 30 odd years, and that is one of the problems. Fostering is a very interesting market, and this is another word I've learned along the way. It's a monopsony, and a monopsony, as you might think, is quite like a monopoly, except it's when there's only one person buying. It's not one provider. The only person buying foster care is the state. The only person purchasing foster care is the state. And you might think that that gives the state a lot of power in the relationship. In fact, they have none. Local authorities spend a great deal on commissioning and on commissioning frameworks. And frankly, at the end of the day, they're meaningless, because as someone pointed out earlier, we have the rule of 5 p.m. and you've got placement teams, and placement teams in local authorities tend to be quite low paid staff who spend their days being shouted at by other people more senior to them who are desperate to find placements. It's quite I think it's a very difficult job for them to do. And they're facing a situation where they're going to agencies who have the best interests of their owners at heart. Some of the biggest fostering agencies in the UK are owned by people called things like Sterling Square Capital Partners, Graphite Capital, CareTech, people who take UK taxpayers' money but don't pay taxes in the UK. You'll find they have shell company after shell company that ends up in Luxembourg or the Cayman Islands or Jersey. And there is a huge problem in that needs addressing. Mark Riddell, who's the care leavers advisor at the DfE, says there's talks going on about should there be a cap on prices, which is what he advocates, which we're great advocates of, because that might take private equity out in the market. And that is part of the problem. Another issue is exactly the one Laurel said, the regional adoption agencies. Edward Timpson's initial thought about them is that there should be fostering agencies as well, and I would welcome that. I think that the geographic reach needs to be greater. Most London authorities have foster carers in their neighbouring boroughs and vice versa. It's, you know, children don't see local authority boundaries, families don't see local authority boundaries. Bigger agencies would give them more choice and more capacity in terms of recruitment. Recruitment of foster carers is an art to a degree. When someone wants to be a foster carer, when they pick up the phone to the local authority or an agency, that's the end of a journey for them. They've talked about it with friends, family, you know, they've made some, you know, some difficult conversations and come to this decision. They don't want to be phoned back in 2 weeks' time. You know, they want to talk about it that day. They want to be seen that week. They want to get on with it. They want to move. In terms of what we can do with assessments, I think it's about, as social workers, as agencies, being less small c conservative about, you know, situations that we might find that challenge our thinking about family life and challenge our thinking about how can this work, because we can be excluding a family who might be perfect for some children. And so I think it's about broadening our bandwidth, if you like, as to what a good family could be. I think we need to hopefully get away from the commissioner relationship. I think it's poisonous. I don't think it does children any good at all. I think we need to have much closer working between agencies and local authorities in recruiting together to cover the needs of the geography they're covering together. I think if we can take private profit out of it, I think that will help, because I think that does skew things and it does make life difficult. We have, for example, agencies who will attempt to offer inducements to foster carers to move from local authorities to that agency. All these things are poisonous. They really shouldn't be happening. And so getting the market out. And interestingly, you've got some very dyed-in-the-wool conservatives like David Simmons, who's on the Education Committee now, used to be at Hillingdon, who absolutely agrees that, you know, the private sector have no place in the fostering world, and it would be good if that was followed through sometime in the coming care review. Maybe we'll get it. Martin Neri, who I'll join Ravinder's views about that, completely ducked that issue, just dodged it completely, which was a real cop-out during the review of fostering that took place then. So I think all the things that have been suggested are useful, but we need to change the dynamic completely of how the market, and let's not make a mistake, it is a market at the moment, how it's working, because it's not working in the best interests of children. And, you know, we know many occasions when, you know, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, placement team have found a foster placement, but they want to charge an awful lot of money for it, and try and have a conversation with a commercial agency who say, you know, well, we'll talk to you at 4:45, because they know that you're going to be talking to them at 4:45, because quite often all the commissioning in the world can lead you to having one family as your option for that child. So it's not bringing any choice, and it's not bringing any choice to the child. I think I'll stop there and open it up to others.
Thank you. So, yeah, does anybody want to add to that? So this theme is about not developing opportunities. This theme is about regional commissioning, you know, the market, the issue of this being a market, and then minimising out of pocket vacant periods. And then I'll move on to the next theme.
Laurelle, perhaps I could come in here?
Absolutely.
Yes, and I'll say a bit more about where I'm coming from when it comes to my part of the session. But I just want to say how much I agree with so much as what had been said, specifically this issue about the market and having to consider cost benefit in the way that we do. I mean, as other people have pointed out in many different spheres, it's always very short-sighted and always very short-term in terms of the impact that thinking in terms of financial profit has. And I mean, you know, to me it was an absolute shock to one day discover, it felt like overnight, suddenly there were all of these private shell companies working in the care system for our young people. So and I just thought, how did that even happen? It almost like happened under the radar, I think, as far as the public were concerned, because certainly when I started to tell other people about it, they were shocked too. And I think, as others have said, including Andy most recently, that, you know, it's really, really important that this is something that is looked at and given proper scrutiny when the review takes place, and it should be thrown out. I mean, I just can't believe that we're actually doing that. And I noticed that, Laurelle, you put in your notes that in some of the places you visited, it's absolutely not for profit. I mean, you know, how could it be otherwise? So I do think that is bound up with a certain kind of political ideology, obviously, and we're seeing it in the current crisis, but also it's tied up with that political short-termism. And, you know, to be honest, I feel that in terms of the general public and their perception of care experienced children and their birth parents is pretty negative often, and I think it therefore doesn't become like a subject that's high up the agenda. And as soon as you throw the children of asylum seekers into that mix, even more so, becomes even more negative. And so this is a very, very difficult area, the nature of which has changed over the years in many respects, but in other respects is the same as it was half a century ago. That's all for now.
Thank you very much. And I guess that is the challenge, really, that these systems are tied to politics, ideologies, etc. And the priorities that come along with that, which is a challenge, a massive challenge. Yep, go on, Brigitte.
No. I was just going to say that I echo what it's really good to hear, and what Andy has said. I think local authorities are often in a very, very complicated situation. I think that it's for us, it should all be about the child, and it sometimes feels as though it's got lost, and I think as social workers at heart, it is about the child, and a lot of social workers are very conflicted in this in the current situation. And we see the benefit of some of the regional work that we are part of in Barnet, because we're part of the North London Consortium. We've been sharing placements and sharing information about recruitment and recruiting together for years, and there are definitely advantages to that, because although the demographics of our children might be slightly different at different times, they're generally the same, but sometimes our young people can't stay in Barnet because it's not safe for them. And then we have other options within local authority carers. And I think that is great, because then we're not moving them north to a place that they don't identify with and that they feel so foreign in. They can actually stay within a context that they understand, and that enables them to really be able to settle and to be part of the London borough, the London that they know. And I think those are the things that we need to think about rather than profits.
Absolutely, thank you, Brigitte. And Ione Henry has added into the chat, I agree with you, Laurelle, care is not for profit. I too have experienced foster carers abroad. Foster care is a passion and a lifelong vocation, and absolutely agree with you there as well, Ione, thank you. So I want to come to you now, Lola, and focus on the final theme for today's webinar, or this launch, which is about young people. And so I had some recommendations. One was local authorities should incorporate network developing opportunities for care experienced young people approaching independence into their care leaver local offer and pathway plan process. And the other recommendation was that local authorities and voluntary and community sector organisations should develop and roll out innovative and effective programmes for care leavers to learn and test out practical independent living skills. And this was based on, so on the networking in Germany, for example, we actually had German colleagues come over and meet with Brigitte's team in Barnet and Andy's team in TACT to share some of the practice that they use in Germany, and also to learn and see on the ground some of the practice that we have here in a local authority context, in the independent fostering agency context. And in Germany, they are doing so much to connect young people to other young people who are care experienced, to open up their networks, their relationships, so that they don't feel so alone and isolated when they leave care. And also in terms of the programs across Germany and Sweden, some of the work that they're doing to really try and give young people practical skills, going on a residential and you guys have to decorate the whole house, you have to wire plugs, you've got to change light bulbs, that was standard. That wasn't a postcode lottery depending on what your local authority director thought was important for your leaving care service. That was just standard practice. And for me, we have really good examples. We've got like the house project here in England doing some stuff like that, but it's not across the board. It is a postcode lottery. And so I just wondered what your thoughts were, thinking about your roles, your personal and professional experiences. What practical steps could be taken by local authorities to kind of innovate and take some, action in these areas?
Thank you very much, Laurelle, and also thank you for this opportunity to have this spot today. And I'm just glad that you were fortunate enough to embark on your research before the pandemic hit us, because it's a really valuable and important piece of work, I think, that should have wider dissemination and important consequences. So I just want to say a little bit about where I'm coming from, because I think that sort of gives a framework to what follows. And I'll say the negative first. I'm not and haven't really ever been a practitioner within this field. I've not been a social worker. I've had experience with the legislation, some of the legislation around this subject area, but really where I'm coming from and what drove me to pick up on this subject when I was in the House of Lords was the fact that I'm a care experienced person myself. So I speak, you know, I do find it hard sometimes not to, you know, there's a very strong emotional component to the way I think about this. And so for me, it's only about the child. You know, that is the most important thing. And I think, you know, it's interesting that you said just now, Laurelle, about the practical schemes. And there are lots of ways I would think with a little bit of imagination that you could actually, you know, build up a number of areas in which young people who are care experienced could get some of the practical skills under their belt, as it were, by linking up with other groups of people and other people within communities, for example, older people, which could have a really beneficial impact. But it's also to say that perhaps even more so than that, to me, it's about the emotional and the psychological, the mental well-being aspect of being care experienced, which is paramount. I think somebody in the chat mentioned earlier that, you know, care experiences for life. It isn't just for that moment. I was in care the whole of my childhood. And, you know, that is always going to be with me. That doesn't ever go away. So how do you actually deal with that? And how do people who haven't been through that experience, whether for a short or a long time, identify, imagine, empathize with that position for that person? Absolutely critical. So to me, you know, it's really, really important. And I think the person that you visit, I think Monica, you call her, I think, you know, it was kind of evident in some of what she was saying and what you said in front of what she said, this thing about confidence building. If you're being bullied at school, which I think you mentioned in your report that she was, you're being bullied at school because you're not living with your parents. Well, how is that? How is that going to be helpful to you when you're already in this incredibly difficult situation? You're quite well aware that you've been separated for one reason or another, and that reason is never positive. It's always going to be a negative thing for you. So who are the kinds of people, and I'm not, obviously foster carers have a huge role to play, but I think that role that you play as an independent visitor is something that's worthy of looking at and thinking about how more can be made of that for more people, because I think that having a younger person in contact with whoever it is whose care experience could be really important. Somebody who understands what it's like in their recent history, perhaps, to been bullied at school. What is you know, it's to me the most important thing to think about is what is the best childhood experience would we want as professionals or legislators or whatever for our children, and why is it that we're not thinking in these terms and implementing policies in these terms for these young people who are going through these difficult periods, no matter how short or long they are? As I said earlier, I'm not a practitioner, but I've done a little bit of work around legislation, actually mainly around care leavers. And I do think that's a really, really important point. The whole thing about access to records, that's another lottery postcode issue. The extent to which you get encouraged to look at your records, the kind of support you do or don't get, especially if you're over 25 or so, is really a big issue. Ravinda raised the issue, but others have picked up on the this point about racism too. So imagine, you know, you're in care, you're being bullied at school, you're not doing as well at school as you might, you're shoved around from one family to another, and you've got to cope with racism and maybe with people who don't understand the impact of that on you, howsoever that manifests itself, and in whatever group that is directed at. And especially, again, if you think about the impact on confidence, on mental health and well-being, it's really difficult. So I guess, you know, obviously I totally agree with all of your recommendations, but especially those that relate to sustaining young people's sense of themselves, of a person who is worthy of being looked after in a really good, positive way. And I think in addition to that, I'll just finally say that we do tend to focus a lot on the negative side of things, you know, and there's a level on which you kind of have to do that, especially if you want to change things. But by the same token, we need to be encouraging to some of the young people as well, to think that it's not like a kind of sentence, a life sentence on them because they've been through this experience. So although, yes, it does remain with you, it doesn't have to be something that makes you into a specific kind of person that will, for example, fail at school, or will, for example, get trapped into the criminal justice system. So we ought to be mindful of the ways in which we can encourage those young people and networks. And I think especially if you can get former care experienced young people involved in that, and maybe mentoring, look again at this independent visitor scheme, and also look at the opportunities within communities of helping and exchanging, as it were, interpersonal skills as well as practical skills with other people within the communities. And I'll stop there, I think.
Thank you very much. And what you said, you know, this actually doesn't cost a lot to set up a exchange, for example, with the community, you know, interpersonal skills or practical skills, especially if we think about the impact of COVID-19. In another hat that I wear in a different job that I have, social isolation is one of the key areas of our work that we're trying to address, especially because it's been exacerbated by COVID-19. So we have so many parts of our community where we know that they're isolated, we know that we have a digital divide, we know that there are assets that we could tap into, even though what actually the lens that we're viewing these communities and these people through is one that's, you know, is quite sad, isolation. So I really appreciate your comments there, and I really hope that those watching, especially if you are in local authorities or independent fostering agencies, can explore, you know, what these are not things that are expensive, but they will have huge impacts and benefits for our young people. And we know we talk about relationship-based practice all the time, the value of relationships, the value the difference that can make to young people, many of whom are recovering from trauma and their early childhood experiences. So we're just coming into the last 10 minutes. I'm going to give our panelists an opportunity to summarise their final thoughts on the report, or, you know, what you think that one thing you want people to go away and think about doing. And also those of you who are watching, if you want to drop any comments into the chat, please do so, because we're just heading into our final 9 minutes now. So I'm going to go around clockwise. So I've got Andy in my top left.
Just really to echo what was just said, two things to go away and think about. One, the worst sort of poverty there is in the care system is the poverty of aspiration for our foster children. Sometimes, you know, we had an experience recently where someone had expressed an interest in, you know, working in the veterinary profession, and was told, oh, you know, you can think of being a veterinary nurse. This is a straight A student. Foster carer said to her, forget about that, you're going to be the vet. You know, it's this kind of thing that we need to be saying. And two, there's a cultural shift needed. We have decided as the state to be the parents of certain children. We have made a decision we're going to be their parents. We don't get to cop out at 18, 21 or 25. We're their parents for life. And it's a disgrace that there isn't a service for every care experienced adult in the country ongoing. We've set up something called Tap Connect because we've just decided that we've got a duty of care for these children lifelong. So we're setting up an organisation, thanks to the lottery, have given us some funding for it. We're using care experienced people to be the mentors and to lead and design it. We're going to have a service that is there to connect them to these employment opportunities, to these skills, to use some of our connections to be the sharp elbow parents who get them the internship, who get them the opportunity. And also that they can connect with each other, because the biggest thing about the care experience in your 20s and early 30s, and sometimes beyond, is loneliness. It's isolation, and it's having those connections to people around you who had a similar experience, but also to key you into what's going in your local community and get you involved in groups there. And some of these things aren't very expensive to do when you get them going, but you have to do them. And you've got to be there to celebrate the successes as people go through life, but also to offer a helping hand when things haven't gone so well. Because we know that care experience people are much closer to homelessness than other members of the community, because, you know, a relationship goes south or a job goes wrong, you know, you're not far from being on the streets. You haven't got that spare room to go back into and live in for 3 months and to dust yourself down and to head back into the world. And I think we need to remember that. There needs to be a cultural shift in the country that we are parents for life. You know, if you've got your own kids, you don't stop parenting. You're 18, you're on your own. Don't bother coming back. We're changing the locks. It's not how it works. Well, not in most families anyway.
Exactly. I mean, I'm in my 30s and I still have a key to my mum's house to rock up when I want. So
exactly.
Exactly. Thank you, Andy. So clockwise, next we have Brigitte. And before you come in, we have a question actually for you. How successful is Barnet in engaging young people in workplace opportunities as corporate parents within the local authority? And I'm really excited about your response, because I know that this is an area that you totally smashed it in the inspection. We worked really hard on this.
Okay, let me remember what I said. No, that was one of our huge ambitions. And I think to answer that, first of all, it's important to note the language. I mean, tonight we call our children so many different things, but the most important word that stands out is that they are care experience, so that this is an experience that they carry with them. And our ambitions for them have to go beyond that 18, go beyond the 25, because they need us to be alongside them all the way. In Barnet, we had a very, very strong emphasis and focus on what the council could offer our care leavers. So we have a number of apprenticeships and going on within the council. So we actually got a lot of collaboration from the whole council. And I think that is important to remember. You know, it's not just about children's services. Corporate parenting is everyone's responsibility within the council, and we all need to stand up and work with our young people and continue to work with our young people. I think part of our success with our care experience young people was also about listening to them about their ambitions and not imposing our own. So, you know, if I I know we've only got a few more minutes, so I'll keep this short, but it is really about having those conversations, listening, and knowing that young people at 18 might have different ambitions to when they're at 25. And as parents, we need to move with their ambitions, and we need to have that flexibility to actually encourage them along that journey. So we've been able to be very creative around allowing people to do courses that are just off a little bit off kilter, but that is their interest, and we've seen the benefits, and we've seen young people grow in those journeys.
And just to add to that also, Catherine, we focused on removing some of the structural issues. So some of the structural issues with that, young people couldn't get onto an apprenticeship because they didn't have the level 2. So we focused on developing traineeships. So we got the stepping stone there. They could do the traineeship and then go on to the apprenticeship. We also looked at training for staff around raising aspirations for young people. So like Andy was saying, not suggesting things like the nurse, actually thinking bigger and stepping alongside the young person, the aspirations they had for themselves. On to Ravinda. Hello.
Thank you, Laurelle.
Hi, very quickly, I won't actually echo everything that everyone else has said, but absolutely agree that the state as a corporate parent, local authority as a corporate parent, needs to do much better than it does. But I just want to pick up on therapeutic support, therapeutic care to promote the holistic well-being of children in care, which is absolutely essential. And that can come, and I think that's where creativity is needed on the part of the corporate parent. And that can come from a range of different settings, different areas. So obviously, you know, through active and dedicated foster care, it can come through leaving care teams, through, you know, one-to-one group work activity, peer learning, you know, having mental health workers embedded in leaving care teams, or improved access to counselling. You mentioned residential trips, for instance, Laurelle. I mean, you're absolutely right, that happens, but it's just so ad hoc. And I think actually, you know, young people get so much from that kind of an experience. And it might be, as you say, that, you know, they're kind of perhaps refurbishing a home and there's so much to learn, but it might be that it's actually perhaps more focused around, I don't know, art-based activities, or might be sport as a form of therapy, sport as a form of resilience. Lola mentioned independent visitors. I think that's great, but just to kind of perhaps be controversial a little, that I think that's fantastic, but I think that kind of act of volunteerism can disrupt also quite easily unless it's supported well, and it can lead to issues of mistrust, betrayal on the part of the young person, and it can have that negative impact on their well-being too. But I think, you know, it's good when local authorities use that, but it's kind of using it again creatively and with support. Mentoring is absolutely key through, you know, former care experienced people, as Lola has said. And actually, as I say, being creative. And it's not just about box ticking and thinking, okay, we've got some inspection coming up, and if we can only demonstrate that we've done X, Y, and Z. I think really social work as a profession needs to move away, but it's not doing so at the moment, from these sort of actuarial risk assessments and assessments in general. I mean, I won't end on a negative note, but I think there's lots of creativity that can be had, and we see pockets of it, but I think we need to see it in a more uniform way across the spectrum.
Exactly, that's the aim. How do we spread that across so it is that the business as usual? And thank you. And then to wrap us up, Lola, which I think is actually fitting given that you've spoken from your own care experience perspective, so if you just like to conclude for us.
Oh gosh, right. Well, you know, everybody said so many things that are really important and with which I agree. And I think, you know, it's absolutely right what Ravinda said about the visit, the IVs, because I guess the only one I know is Laurelle. So, you know, what can I say? There's a great sort of model of how that can work. But I absolutely see what you're saying in terms of how that's handled and how people are prepared for that and how that is used in a productive way. I would also pick up on Ravinda. I mean, my background is in the arts and creative industries, and what's quite distressing is to hear, you know, the comment that Andy reported about the student, the young person who was told, oh yes, you can be a veterinary nurse. You know, aim for the lowest end. And I don't mean that in any kind of derogatory sense at all. But I remember when I said, well, I wanted to work in publishing to my social worker, and she said, oh no, that's not for you. That's not for the likes of you. And that attitude, although it's, you know, maybe softened and a bit more sophisticated, is still around, I think, that kind of putting a cap on your aspirations. Just on a kind of more sort of practical level, Laurelle, I'm thinking that perhaps your report could be discussed at the all-party parliamentary group for looked after children. That would be where we'd had perhaps, I'm not quite sure how many parliamentarians have been on this call, but I think it would warrant further discussion by parliamentarians, particularly in view of the forthcoming review. And just again to pick up on the other thing that Ravinda was saying, that I just alluded to a little bit earlier, this idea about arts and culture. Yes, around the kind of therapeutic thing, but also we need much more diversity in its broadest sense in those sectors. And, you know, I've been sort of working with cultural organizations now for many decades. And one of the things that I'm really interested in, because of my experience and others that I know of in the care system, is this idea of cultural enrichment. If you're a really nice sort of middle class family, you know, you take your kids to the museum of whatever, one weekend into an art gallery, another weekend you have a little bit of a talk about it, you talk about the range of jobs there are in those sectors. We need to broaden that kind of sense of of who is who can be encouraged to think about being within those professions, within those areas. And I think, you know, that the more you can get people out into a wider range of positions and to raise not just the levels of aspiration, but the expectation that they deserve better. Because I think that's one of the things that really crushes you when your care experience, if you're not helped through that, is that idea that you don't deserve and you don't deserve as much as other children appear to you to have. So I'd just like to finish by again thanking Laurelle and all my colleagues on the panel for putting this thing together, because I think it's been really, really interesting, and hopefully we'll have traction with those who can make the changes that we've discussed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lola. A massive thank you to all the panelists and a huge thank you to everyone who joined. A final thank you to the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, who of course funded my fellowship. A special thank you to Katie and Naomi, because it was a struggle for me to come back and write this report and study at the same time, but they have been so supportive and also explored additional research categories around the care experience. So really excited to see where that goes. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Laurelle.
Cheers. Thanks very much, Laurelle. It was great.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurelle.